The year of the shave. 2022, New York City. Zoe Davis was a 28-year-old artist living in Brooklyn. She had long, flowing blonde hair that she took great pride in. One day, Zoe received a strange letter. It was from someone claiming to have evidence that could ruin Zoe's budding art career. The letter demanded that Zoe shave her head or the damaging information would be released. Zoe was shocked and appalled by the bizarre request. After discussing with her boyfriend Alex, Zoe decided to comply to protect her career. She went to Tony's barbershop, a old-fashioned joint known for quick, no-frills men's haircuts. When Zoe entered the antique barbershop poles spinning outside the door, the chatter inside went silent as the male customers stared at her. Zoe nervously approached the front counter where the owner, Tony, was tidying up. "Hello, I'm here to see Tony," Zoe said, her voice wavering. Tony raised his eyebrows, looking her up and down. "I'm Tony. What can I do for you, miss?" he asked gruffly. Zoe took a deep breath and said, "I need to speak with you privately about something urgent." Tony frowned briefly, then nodded, leading Zoe past the curious onlookers into a small back room used for storage and capes. He pulled out a folding chair for Zoe, then sat down across from her. "So what's this about?" Tony asked. Zoe proceeded to explain the bizarre blackmail situation and the demand that she shave her head or else damaging information would be leaked. Tony listened intently, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "That's quite a story," he said. "But if you need me to shave your head, I'll do it, no problem. I don't want to see you get hurt by this scumbag." Zoe sighed in relief and thanked him. Tony patted her shoulder and said, "It'll be all right. Hair grows back. Now let's get this over with." He led her back into the main barbershop area. The chatter quieted again as the male customers eyed Zoe curiously. Tony told her, "Have a seat over there until I finish up with the next few guys, then it'll be your turn." He motioned to an empty chair by the window. Zoe sat down, watching Tony's reflection in the mirrors as he called over the next customer. She fidgeted with her hair, knowing these were the last moments with it. The two men made eye contact through the mirror, exchanging a knowing glance about the peculiar situation. Tony put a striped cape on the customer and picked up his buzzing clippers. Zoe watched the hair falling to the floor with every pass of the clippers. The customer left freshly shorn with a military-style crew cut. Another man took his place, and the process repeated. In no time, Tony had completed 2 more nearly identical haircuts. The men brushed fallen hair off their shoulders and paid Tony as they left. Finally, it was just Tony and Zoe. He waved her over to the now empty barber chair and gestured for her to have a seat. Zoe slowly walked over and sat down. She took one last look at her long blonde hair before turning to face herself in the mirror. She was ready for her drastic makeover to begin. She took one last look at her long blonde hair before turning to face herself in the mirror. Zoe ran her hands through the length of it, as if saying goodbye. Tony made eye contact with Zoe in the reflection and said, "Okay, let's get this over with." He removed his barber's cape from the previous customer and shook it out before swirling it around Zoe's neck and fastening it snugly. The stiff cape and its bold stripes seemed out of place with Zoe's feminine style. She watched Tony in the mirror as he selected a pair of sharp scissors from his tool drawer. Tony ran a wide-toothed comb slowly through Zoe's long locks one last time. "So, did you want to donate your hair afterwards?" he asked. Zoe pondered a moment before replying, "No, I'd rather not have any evidence left of this." Tony nodded. "All right then, let's get started. I'll try to make this quick and as painless as possible." He gently lifted and separated a section of hair on top. The cold steel of the scissors pressed against the back of Zoe's neck. Then, with one quick movement, over a foot of blonde hair fell to the floor. Zoe gasped as she saw the severed ponytail drop. She couldn't turn back now. It was really happening. Tony continued working methodically around her head, grabbing large chunks of hair and cutting them off near the nape of her neck. The piles of shorn blonde hair grew around the base of the barber's chair. Once the length was removed, Tony switched to electric clippers. He started at Zoe's sideburns, carefully carving them into a feminine shape. The buzzing of the clippers vibrated against Zoe's scalp as they inched up her head. Tony tilted Zoe's head forward, and she watched the pile of blonde hair on the floor grow as the clippers traveled across the back of her head. He maneuvered them slowly and deliberately, maintaining an even cut length. Moving to the top, Tony changed to a longer clipper guard. Zoe felt the tool tip grazing her scalp as it cropped down the hair on top to match the back and sides. Tony then removed the guard completely, using the bare clippers to shave the nape of Zoe's neck clean. The plastic cape was coated in a fine layer of her shed blonde hair. With a few finishing touches around her hairline, Tony completed Zoe's dramatic transformation. But Zoe's hair was still cropped close, not fully shaved. Tony said, "Okay, now for the actual head shave," as he pulled out a can of shaving cream. He shook it up and dispensed a generous mound of dense white foam into his palm. Gently, Tony massaged the thick lather all over Zoe's head, covering every spot down to the skin. The shaving cream felt cool and soothing on her freshly buzzed scalp. With a razor in hand, Tony slowly tipped Zoe's head back over the sink. Starting at her forehead, he gingerly scraped the razor down the front of her head, removing all traces of stubble and cream. Rinsing the razor frequently, Tony continued shaving off what little hair was left. Long, smooth strokes revealed Zoe's bare scalp inch by inch. He carefully shaved around her ears and hairline until no visible hair follicles remained. Tony toweled off the last bits of shaving cream and rubbed Zoe's smooth head gently to check for any missed patches. Her scalp glistened under the lights, bare for the first time ever. Zoe ran her own hand across her slick, shaven head, amazed by the foreign sensation. With her hair now completely gone, her exposed scalp marked the start of her new life. As the reality sunk in, Zoe's eyes began to well up with tears. Her lip quivered as she stared back at the bald stranger in the mirror. Zoe brought her hands to her face and broke down crying. Tony stood motionless, giving Zoe space to have her emotional moment. He looked on sympathetically as her shoulders shook with each sob. Zoe's cries echoed through the empty old barber shop. After a minute, Zoe's weeping slowed to just sniffles. She wiped the tears from her swollen eyes and took a few deep, shaky breaths to recompose herself. Without a word, Tony removed the hair-coated cape from around Zoe's neck and gently brushed off any remaining hairs stuck to her clothes. He stepped back and waited silently for her next move. Zoe sat staring blankly ahead for a few more moments, processing what had just happened. She then slowly stood up on wobbly legs and turned to Tony. Her eyes were still glistening. "Thank you," Zoe said softly, her voice raspy from crying. She reached into her pocketbook, paid Tony, then paused. "There's one more thing I need you to do," she continued hesitantly. Zoe pulled her phone out of her bag and held it out to Tony. "I need you to take some photos of me to send to the blackmailer as proof that I went through with this." She choked up again on the last few words. Tony's eyes widened, but he nodded in understanding as he took the phone from Zoe's shaky hand. "I can't imagine how difficult this is for you," Tony said gently. "I'll try to make this as quick and painless as possible." He stepped back and motioned for Zoe to stand in front of the barber's chair. She complied, sniffling and wiping her eyes once more. Tony looked through the phone camera as he circled around Zoe. "I'll just take a few from different angles," he explained. Zoe gave a weak nod in response. She stood with slumped shoulders as the camera shutter sounded again and again. Tony was efficient and discreet as he photographed Zoe's freshly shorn head. After several shots, he said, "Okay, all done," and handed the phone back to Zoe. She managed a faint "thank you" before turning and walking out of the barbershop, photos in hand to appease her exploiter. Zoe stepped outside into the busy city street. The cold air prickled her newly exposed scalp. She kept her head down, feeling self-conscious about her drastic makeover. Finding the nearest bench, Zoe sat and opened up her text messages. With shaking hands, she attached a couple photos of her shorn head and sent them to the anonymous blackmailer. The reply came quickly. "Well done." Zoe felt a chill down her spine reading the short response. This was just the beginning of the blackmailer's bizarre demands.